This is lecture 8.1. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about race and ethnicity. Specifically, we're going to be talking about definitions of race and ethnicity, certain demographics in the United States, why defining racism isn't actually very easy, and some approaches to addressing problems. So, starting with our base definition. Race is a socially defined category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. Examples of race include African American or Black, white or Caucasian, Asian, Native American. These are races that we commonly think of here in the United States. For example, I am white. That's my race. Ethnicity, then, is a socially defined category based on cultural factors such as language, religion, nationality, history, or, again, cultural factors. Examples of ethnicity include some Pennsylvania Dutch, Somali, Cherokee, or Mexican. I am white by race, and my family is ethnically Pennsylvania Dutch. We descend from a certain group of people that colonized Pennsylvania in the late 1700s who came from the area that is now Germany. One of the symbols of the Pennsylvania Dutch is this cultural item on the slide known as a hex sign. Most often they would decorate barns, and that is a cultural artifact of my ethnicity. Now, sometimes race and ethnicity can be a little bit difficult to define, and really I didn't fully understand the difference whether being Latino or Latinx is a ethnicity or a race. Now, the family in Encanto does an amazing job of illustrating this. They live in a fictional village in Latin America, so they are ethnically Latino. They share that cultural identity, but they are a mixed race family. Thus, each individual or certain individuals are of different races than other members of the family. It's a very, very good example. A minority group, then, in sociological terms, is a social group that is systematically denied access to power and resources that are available to the dominant groups in our society. A minority group is not necessarily of fewer in number than the dominant group. For example, in the country of South Africa, the numeric majority of people are Black, but in terms of power, they are a minority group because they have less power than the predominant ruling white Afrikaner class. Sociologists do see race and ethnicity as social constructions because race isn't based on biology. For instance, you can't take a DNA test to determine race, and racial categories change over time. They are part of our culture. Who is considered white today is very different in the United States than who was considered white in the late 1800s. Another example is that before about 2000 or so, not many people identified as being mixed race. However, many people today identify as being mixed race. Does that mean that there weren't mixed race people before 2000? No, people are just coming to identify as being mixed race. So our definition of the idea of race is changing and evolving over time. The distinction between race and ethnicity is very important because ethnicity can be displayed or hidden depending on the individual's preferences. I don't have to tell anybody that I'm Pennsylvania Dutch, and if there was a certain circumstance in society in which Pennsylvania Dutch people were being discriminated against, no one would ever know that was me. While racial identities are always on display. So if you are of a discriminated against racial group, for example, you are in a much more difficult position than if you were in a discriminated against ethnic group. Here are two elements of ethnicity that are somewhat different than elements of race. We have symbolic ethnicity and situational ethnicity. And you may want to focus on the difference between these two things because these are two terms that are relatively easy to get confused. Symbolic ethnicity is an ethnic identity that is only relevant on a specific occasion and does not significantly impact everyday life. So I sometimes call this holiday ethnicity. For example, in the United States, we have some people in the United States that are of Irish descent, but on St. Patrick's Day, many people claim to be of Irish descent, even if they have a relatively small percentage of their heritage being Irish. That's holiday ethnicity. Similarly, among people who traditionally celebrate Christmas, many ethnic groups have very specific Christmas celebrations. That is another example of symbolic ethnicity. Situational ethnicity, then, is an ethnic identity that can be either displayed or concealed depending on its usefulness in a given situation. This is using your ethnicity when it is beneficial. The Pennsylvania Dutch, we have our own language, and if I were to meet someone that spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, I do speak a little bit of Pennsylvania Dutch. I can say something like, Ich ben Duits am Lernen, which means I am learning Pennsylvania Dutch, and that would gain me a certain degree of situational ethnicity credit there. That's what that is. It's using your ethnicity when it works for you in a given situation. Now let's talk about some demographics in the United States in terms of racial groups. Our society is becoming increasingly diverse. This is a trend that is decades old. Non-whites currently make up 38% of the total US population. Thus, whites are still in the numeric majority, and they are in the power majority as well. However, non-whites are projected to be the numeric majority by 2040. Now, white people will still be of the largest group by numbers of people, but white people will no longer be more than 50% of the population. So by saying that in 2040, it will mean that white people will be 49% of the population, and all other groups will make up that other 51% of the population. The majority of babies under the age of 2 in the year 2010 were non-white. And migration is the primary engine of population growth in the United States. That's quite common among modern post-industrial societies that have reasonable access to healthcare, because population growth is driven by birth rate and migration. In the United States, everyone that wants access to birth control pretty much can get access to birth control. So as a result of that, our population rate stays relatively steady in terms of birth rates. So where our growth of numbers of people comes from then is by people choosing to come to the United States. And by 2050, 1/5 of the US population will be immigrants, which is, again, immigration is very much part of our national character. It's always an important factor to take into consideration. The number of people in the United States identifying as mixed race is increasing, as I alluded to. In the year 2000, 2.4% of the population identified as being multiracial or mixed race on the US Census. In 2010, 2.9% of that population identified as being mixed race. Now that seems relatively minor if you just look at the percentage, but that is an increase of more than 2 million people. That is far greater than the birth rate of a given group, which indicates that in that 10-year span, far more people started identifying as being mixed race, and that's where that jump of 2 million people comes from. Why is that? Well, in 2000, as I alluded to, the US Census Bureau first permitted respondents to choose more than one race. And also, of course, more children are being born into interracial partnerships, and our definitions of race are actually changing. It was once thought in the United States, for example, when we're talking about being African American, it was thought that if you were at least a little bit black, then you were completely black. That was called the one-drop rule, and originally it was used to discriminate against black people. Then in the mid-20th century, black advocacy groups, certain black power groups as well, they said, you know what, if you are one drop, African American or 1 drop black, then you are black, you're part of our community. So that idea, it was retaken back by the African American community. However, now, today, it is far more acceptable to identify as being mixed race. So you may be very proud of your African American heritage or whatever heritage you're of, and it is entirely okay now to not just pick a racial team, but identify as all of your racial groups that you are a part of. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how defining racism isn't easy. So there are multiple ways to define racism, and this makes it quite difficult for very well-intending people who are trying to fix problems with race, because you can be having a conversation about race and racism, and depending on your definition of racism, you may hold a very different definition than what their definition of racism is. And if you're both using the same word, race or racism, but you're talking about different concepts, it can be very, very difficult to come to solutions or have conversations, especially civil conversations. One basic definition of racism that the vast majority of our society agrees on is that racism is a set of beliefs about the superiority of one racial or ethnic group. There isn't a great definition for ethnicityism that all classifies as being racism. I wish there was a different word, but there really isn't. So that type of racism, of the superiority of one group over another group, is no longer acceptable in American society. That, of course, there are certainly people that say those things, not in public, but in general, that's considered not cool, for good reason. When these instances of racism occur, it is often accidental. People do not intend to show that they believe these ideas. The other definition we're talking about then involves social structure and involves a little bit more nuance. And I'll talk about that in a few slides. But first, we're going to talk a little bit more about this base definition of racism, of the superiority or inferiority of certain groups. Prejudice, then, is a thought process. Prejudice is an idea about the characteristics of a group, and it is applied to all members of that group in the prejudiced mind. Prejudice is unlikely to change regardless of evidence against it, because prejudice is not a logical idea. You can't logic away prejudice from an individual. It's something that has to come through experience, unfortunately. You really can't argue someone out of being prejudiced. Discrimination, then, is an action. Discrimination is unequal treatment of individuals based on their social group. So, if I have negative feelings towards, say, Jewish people, that is a prejudice. But if I don't act on those negative feelings, I am not discriminating. If I do act on those negative feelings, then I am discriminating, because discrimination is often based on prejudice. Individual discrimination, then, is discrimination carried out by one person against another person. For example, if a landlord does not rent to you because you're black, but doesn't give that as a reason, that is them acting on their discrimination, which is on an individual level, even though they are not expressing that prejudice. You can see how this is quite insidious. Instances of individual discrimination, then, are often called by a phenomenon known as implicit bias. Implicit bias is a very well-documented sociological and psychological phenomena in which many people have some type of subconscious bias present in our brains. Most people have some degree of implicit bias in their brains. You can take an implicit bias test online. I suggest taking any of the implicit bias tests produced by Harvard University. They have very good implicit bias tests. I don't assign people to take implicit bias tests because I think people need to come to those growth moments by themselves, but I absolutely encourage you to take an implicit bias test. And if you do take an implicit bias test and you find you are biased against a certain group or another group, the really good scientific news about that is that when you take if you find your implicit bias group, a group that you're biased against, and then you take in the media of those people, if you read about certain like heroes of that group, that has actually shown that it's called contact theory. When you have contact with a group over time, your implicit bias reduces, which is a really neat scientific finding. Institutional discrimination, then, is systematic discrimination carried out by a social institution. Thus, social institutions such as a political, economic, educational group, maybe a religious group, whatever. And that affects all members of the group who come in contact with it. So for example, if a condo association has a rule against renting against African Americans, as opposed to a landlord specifically not renting against African Americans, that is institutional discrimination. And this type of discrimination is now fully illegal, but that does not mean it does not still happen. For example, if you're running a food pantry, and to get into that food pantry, you have to go up a step. Well, that is institutional discrimination against people who are trying to get into the food pantry who are actually disabled and not able to go up a step or a couple steps. Nobody in the food pantry is trying to keep people with disabilities out, but it has the institutional effect of making that happen. Now let's talk about a more complex definition of racism. Racism, in this more complex definition, is a system of oppression that is embedded into our society. This is what can be called as the racism as structure definition. Thus, racism occurs when people are oppressed, when a minority group is unable to do the same things as the dominant group. So thus, from this definition, white people in the United States cannot be subject to racism because white people have a large amount of power in the United States, and much greater power than people of other racial groups. So because of that power, then, white people cannot be a victim of the racist structure. Now, does that mean that an individual cannot discriminate against me because I am white and they can't be mean to me? No, that can happen. But it's very, very different than the entire structure of the society being set up against you as a member of a discriminated against group. I always like to emphasize this because many academics, unfortunately, just say things like, well, white people can't be discriminated against, and they never actually fully explain it. And I think this is very important. So as with other things, if you have questions about this, please let me know. So let's talk about some approaches that have been used in the past to address racial problems. And some of these approaches insidiously ugly, some of the worst things humanity's ever done. And you'll see that in a second. So institutional hatred has been used in the past in an attempt to address problems, quote unquote problems, with racial groups. These include items such as genocide, population transfer, internal colonialism, and segregation. Genocide, as most of us are aware, is the deliberate and systematic extermination of a racial, ethnic, national, or cultural group. The most infamous of all genocides was the Holocaust of the Jews during World War II. However, there have been many genocides since then. There are entire disciplines dedicated to studying the crime of genocide, and there are accusations today of genocide happening in certain parts of the world. Population transfer, then, is the forcible removal of a group of people from the territory from which they have traditionally or currently occupy. So you're moving people from one area to another area by force. That is population transfer. Now, while that is bad in and of itself, Population transfer is an international red flag for groups that are trying to monitor when and keep track of when genocide may or may not happen. When population transfer occurs, it is a good indicator that that society is at risk of a genocide starting to happen. The most infamous population transfer in the United States was the Trail of Tears as committed against the Cherokee, in which they were moved from their homelands in the Appalachian Mountains and forced to march to what was then the Oklahoma Territory, which is now the state of Oklahoma. Internal colonialism, then, is the economic and political domination and subjugation of a minority group by the controlling group within that nation. That can take the form of race, that can take the form of regionalism, it can take many forms. In terms of regionalism, the Appalachian region is a very good example of internal colonialism. That region is very, very rich in natural resources. However, during the 1800s and a good chunk of the 1900s, most of the wealth of that area was sent off to New York City and Chicago. There should be, by virtue of resources, a very large city right in the center of the Appalachian Mountains. However, there simply isn't. Nashville's there, there are other cities that are there, but there should be a really big city there. But that's because those resources went to the other major cities of that era, especially on the East Coast. Segregation, then, as occurred in the United States, is a form of legal separation of groups by race or ethnicity. This says this group of people is not allowed to go into this type of facility or this part of a city or whatever. Most of us in the United States, if we know even a piece of American history, are familiar with segregation. There's a similar phenomena that occurred in South Africa known as apartheid, which was a version of segregation, but instead of just facilities, people were not allowed to go into certain areas of the country or even certain areas of cities. Basically a more aggregated version of segregation. Finally, in actually trying to address and trying to help in terms of these issues, the United States, our approach to trying to address these issues have changed over time. We have shifted over the last century from going to an assimilationist mindset to a pluralist mindset. Under the assimilationist mindset, the minority group is absorbed into the mainstream or dominant group, thus making society more homogeneous, making society more all the same. This typically takes the form of racial assimilation or cultural assimilation. Within racial assimilation, racial minority groups are absorbed into the dominant group, often through intermarriage. Cultural assimilation, then, racial or ethnic groups are absorbed into the dominant group by adopting the dominant group's culture. Now, either racial or cultural assimilation can occur somewhat naturally. If you are in a small group and everyone around you is of the dominant group, over time, people will start to fall in love, they'll start to have babies, whatever, and then racial assimilation will occur. Or young people especially will start to take on the cultural patterns of the people around them and not maintain their traditional cultural traditions. That's cultural assimilation. So it can occur somewhat in a not forced way. Where assimilation gets very ugly is where it becomes a forced thing. And there is a very ugly history of both racial assimilation and cultural assimilation in the United States and in many other parts of the world. The most aggravated version of both of these occurred with how Native American people were treated in the late 1800s by the United States government. Finally, then, what we try to push for in our society, one of the reasons why we encourage you to take sociology classes, is so that we can approach pluralism, which is a pattern of intergroup relations that encourages racial and ethnic variation within our society. This is what, at this moment in time, we are pushing for in our society, those of us who are trying to make society a better place from our perspective. Now, does that mean that 20 years from now, 100 years from now, we'll think that pluralism was a good thing? I would like to hope so, but it could be that we're wrong in this regard too. The next generation gets better. That's a general hopeful view of society. Multiculturalism then is a concept, an organizational concept, very, very similar to pluralism. I will not ask you the difference between those two things on an exam, but I point that out because if you work for a company or if you work for a school or an institution, they tend not to call their programs pluralism programs. They tend to call them multicultural programs. Okay, that is it for this lecture, and if you have any questions, just let me know.